LinkedIn land, YouTube, Twitch, and beyond, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2 of Freeformers Unplugged, where we have unplanned, unscripted, unstructured conversations with everything to do with the world of work and all that kind of stuff, really. And today I'm super excited because my guest is incredible. And we're very aligned in having kind of human-centered thinking at the heart of what we both do. You know, with Freeformers, as I will have waxed lyrical on about in terms of using human-centered design to craft, you know, end-to-end employee experiences. The thing that makes that all work is the application of it. And Kul Mahay is here to talk to us about human-centered leadership and the Human-Centered Leadership Conference. And with that, I'm going to bring onto the screen Kul. How you doing, my friend?
How you doing, Toby? Great to see you. And great to be here.
Oh, well, I've got to say, one of the best backdrops that I've ever had on this live stream. So that is a cool light bulb we got going on.
Yours, the Arctic Monkeys one in particular.
This took a long time to figure out what pieces of art. So I've got Arctic Monkeys here, the American version of The Office, and then we have.
I love that.
My favorite director, I'm just going to go down here, is Edgar Wright. So he's directed films like Scott Pilgrim, Baby Driver, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, all those films as well.
I mean, all three of those posters speak strongly to me because I must have watched the American version of The Office, the full series, Call Me Sad, about 3 times.
I don't. It's not a competition, but I'm on my 6th round as we speak. I'm on the last season of my 6th round.
I always say to my wife, "This is just background," but it never ends in background. You end up watching it, don't you?
And so we are kindred spirits, both in terms of human-centered thinking, but also the US version of The Office. Now, I could take us. Do you have a favorite episode? I mean, let's go for that.
Oh my god. I guess my favorite episode, it's a bit soppy. It's the one where I forget the names now, but where they get married.
Oh, Pam and Jim.
Pam and Jim get married, and they go away, and they go married on the boat, but then they come back so that everyone can have their moment. You know.
Yeah.
So they try and please everyone by doing that, but actually they secretly already met. I thought that was a pretty cool episode, and I also like the one where they go to the Indian Diwali celebration, and he takes over.
I think Michael says it's fancy dress, and then his girlfriend at the time dresses as a cheerleader. It's like, I think there's a really great episode that starts where there's a because it talks about training, and you know, we've done a bit of training in my career. He said last week I gave a PowerPoint on fire safety at work, and no one listened. And then he has a cigarette and he goes, "Today smoking is going to save lives," and he makes the office full of smoke, and it's like, this was a simulation. I tried to sell that one, you know, former life as a commercial director for a trading company, tried to sell that concept as like a trading initiative. And you'll like this, and we'll talk more a little bit about your past. But there was a insurance company that a good friend of mine, Alexi, used to work for, and essentially they had a terrorism unit come and storm the building, and said, let's see how people react in this live environment, you know, with real guns and real people, and they flooded the building. So yeah, you know, these real life simulations can work. So Kul, for those of you, because you've not been on my live stream before, who are you? What do you do? And why?
Well, who am I? You know, normally when you get asked this question, you define yourself with the work that you do, but I want to define myself with a passion. So my passion has driven everything that I've done in my entire life. So from the age of 10, all I wanted to be was a cop, Toby. And eventually, when I got to the age of 15 and a half, I applied to every single police force up and down the country. I got 26 rejections. On the 27th one, I got accepted. So I spent 32 years in policing. Ended up for the last half of that as being a senior commander in the police service. I've managed everything from murder investigations through to major incidents, crowd control, been in the middle of riots, lost count of how many dead bodies I've seen. But interestingly, I've always also found within that what makes people tick in the workplace. And, you know, you can imagine the police service is a very hierarchical organization. Everything is about the status and the ranks that you wear. and can be very command and control on occasions. And I wanted to experiment with my leadership style. Can I get more out of people by actually connecting with people? And so that defined my leadership style. And, you know, I always had great performance, great connection, great trust built in the departments that I managed. It ended up being the most moved senior officer. Every department that was failing, I would be like parachuted in. And then the irony is, I once got told, you don't seem to grip people enough, like all the other senior leaders, and yet your performance is higher. So I think that was an interesting conversation that I had with a chief constable. And I said, well, are you saying that I'm a bit weird, or are you saying that the other senior leaders should be a bit more like me, you know? And that was a concept in that time and that day that was a bit alien to the police service. Now I get to work with all sorts of incredible businesses and organizations, large and small, national and local. But those organizations I can pick and choose, because these are the ones that passionately want to see change, positive change in their organizations. And that's where human-centered leadership came into it for me, because I think at the end of the day, human beings sit at the very heart of everything that we do in organizations. And if we lose sight of that, if we can't get that right, then why would we expect our performance to increase, our profit margins to increase? And it's no longer a box that we call soft skills anymore. These are hardcore skills, and I'm so passionate about that. And every time somebody mentions soft skills to me, I have to say something. I just can't resist myself. Plus, I'm getting older, so I say things.
Well, the whole notion of soft skills it feels like it undermines what is important, and is only in the world of AI is only going to become more important, because if you don't have this innate ability to connect with a fellow human being and you're just churning out code, then really you're going to struggle to do anything more than just be a little code factory, as it were, with AI. So just noting, we got Verity in chat, so hello Verity. Just
hey, Verity.
hope you're doing well. And if anyone else out there viewing, let us know if you're viewing, where in the world you're viewing from, particularly if you're in the Derby area. And why is Derby such an important city for us in the month of May, Cole?
Well, Derby is important for a whole host of reasons that are unique to Derby, but in the month of May, I think it's going to become even more important, because that's where we're holding our second Human-Centered Leadership Conference. And I'm particularly excited by this one. We had our first one last year, which was in Birmingham, and this year it's in Derby. And I'm particularly excited because we've got some phenomenal speakers like yourself, for example. But we've got people who are senior leaders in all sorts of industries, from defense organizations who are, organizations that are building missiles, through to the military, through to the police service, through to some of the biggest logistical logistical companies in the country. And we've got, of course, Disrupt HR, which I'm always excited about, because that's like this lightning round of speakers. And all of these are accomplished HR specialists and leaders in their own right. And they're coming in and they're sharing some powerful insights with us in the space of 5 minutes. And you know what that's like. And I've been on those stages. It's incredible. It's a really sort of a powerful moment. But we've also got fireside conversations with people like Alison Leavesley, who is a internationally and globally renowned spiritual and meditation guide, but also does an awful lot of work with senior leaders. We've got some incredible, we're actually going to do a LinkedIn Live from the stage, which I only made the decision on last week. So we're just going all out. It's just going to be so different, the whole structure of the day, but more importantly, the depth of the conversations. This is like a coming together of minds and souls, people who philosophize around leadership and see it from a wholly different lens, that it's beyond the technical skills that we very often talk about, the matrices, the metrics that we measure. This is about people, and understanding why people as a hardcore business skill are so very important in the workplace environment.
And I think this is where we started when we spoke last week, right? Is that the thing that struck me is there are 1,000,001 companies that one of their values, and I'm going to put values in huge,
oh my God, let's talk about values.
is we are customer first, or we are customer centric, which is like, well, duh, like of course you are, otherwise why would you you exist? That doesn't make sense. but what that completely undermines is to what the point you made is that completely undermines like the human element an employee brings to this situation, where actually customer centricity and human centered, customer relationships can only really be manufactured and built if you have a human first organization that applies human centricity to your customer and to your own people. And the thing that baffles me, right, is that these two elements are not that far apart, because you are looking to design things based on the human experience, these interactions.
Yeah.
Yet, because the customer generates the money, that's where all the money goes in developing that. And then when it comes to developing human-centered leadership skills and, a human-centered kind of employee experience, we kind of just let it fall by the wayside and leave it down to policy to manage.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we do. And I find this more and more in the public sector, that what we do, we have such a defensive mentality, and we have all these incredible, powerful values up there on these shiny posters on the wall that says, we are customer centric, we're human centric, or we have integrity or honesty or respect as a core value. But very often for most organizations, these are superficial words, and values have to be lived. And I've gone into many an organization where I've spoken to leaders around the table and said, so what are your values? And they'll point to some shiny poster with all these beautiful words. And I say, yeah, but what are your values as an individual? And then they get stuck. So many people hook onto these organizational values and expect that will take them through, that will define how they work. But very often they don't, because if your values aren't lived, then A, you can't hold people to account against those values, and B, you cannot be human-centric, because those values very often are centered around human beings. And the more your organization is about delivering to humans, the more you need to think about the humans inside your organization as well, because they are the people that will allow you to deliver to the highest level of quality. And it always boils down to a very simple phrase, and that is, happy people work harder. It is not rocket science, really. And I always say, talking about human-centered leadership is easy. Applying human-centered leadership requires leadership courage.
And the thing I reflect on just in what you're saying is I used to work for an organization that wasn't that big. Wasn't that big at all. I'm talking just about made it into double digits. And when they got to that size of 10 people, they went, okay, cool, we're going to put in annual performance reviews. And I was like, really? Why? Oh, because we need to understand how people are working, performing inside the organization. I'm like, okay, you are 2 people running a business, and therefore there are 8 other people. Are you not having conversations and like one-on-one conversations and moments where you kind of know this already before you get to the end of the year? Like, and this is what I mean by the process of what HR and organizations typically deliver doesn't enable human-centered leadership, because it almost gives you this framework to kind of go, well, you've got your mid-year review, you've got your end-of-year review, you've got a promotion process. So all the human leadership stuff you need to do is built around this very rigid framework, where you then kind of go, and then here's a sheet of paper of all the things you need to talk about and discuss. And like, in no other facet of human existence and life if we go to the pub after the conference, let's say, I'm not going to sit there with a checklist. Okay, cool, I'm going to have a conversation with Kul. What are the things I need to talk about, and what things do we need to reflect on, and all that kind of stuff. We're able to do that as humans.
Here's a case in point. If we had scripted this podcast right now, and I'd said to you, only ask these questions, or you had said, we're only going to visit these topics, how stilted would that be? How well would we both perform? And I think unscripted can be really powerful. Now, let's not forget that there are a number of policies that are important in any organizations, and I accept that. But sometimes what I think that happens with organizations is you end up putting a policy on top of a policy, on top of a policy, on top of a policy, out of a sense of risk aversion and defense mentality. And the more you do that, however, what we don't realize is you create tiers of bureaucracy, which then stifles innovation, stifles creativity, slows down your decision-making process. And in a world, let's be honest, that is evolving so fast and so rapidly now, it can leave you behind. So I think there's a real argument for allowing a bit of freedom for the human-centered thinking, the human-centered leadership, the free flow of conversations, the cognitive diversity. And don't even get me started on DEI, because cognitive diversity is where it's really at. And cognitive diversity will drive your creativity, innovation, your agility, your adaptability, all of the things that I think are really, really important in today's world.
I mean, we could have a whole conversation about DEI, because there was talking of disrupt, there was a great talk that I have shared tens of times now, or nearly in the hundreds, by Dr. Silvana Story, that said that kind of, and this was 2 years ago, Disrupt HR in London, that kind of DEI as a function, as an individual in organization, is probably the most ineffective way to drive diversity in your organization, because it's not a bolt-on, it's not a plug-in. It's got to be an inherent part of your organizational design.
Yeah.
And to think that you can just say, oh, now we're a diverse organization, you can't. Like, it's not that. But I think, to your point, like, human-centered leadership is incredibly important to that, because the understanding of different perspectives and different lived experiences, you're only ever going to get through that genuine human connection. If you policy your way out, or process, not even necessarily policy, but process your way out of that, then you're not going to get this realized benefit of all the stuff that you've just said.
100%. And with human-centered leadership, I think DEI is transformed. Now, you know, I've lived through 4 decades of being in the workplace.
You can't be that old. Come on, you must be in your late 30s, surely.
Oh, you are too kind. I'm just a tad over that. When I first joined the police service, I was literally like a brown speck in a sea of white.
Yeah.
And I was automatically seen as the diversity expert. So anything to do with race relations, diversity, it was thrust upon me as if I'm going to be this sole expert just because of the color of my skin. How nonsensical is that? And what I found over the years is that the rhetoric may have changed, the language may have changed, the fundamentals of the thinking, however, are very, very, very similar to what it was 3-4 decades ago. We very often focus as organizations around this whole concept of representation, i.e., a certain percentage of our organization has to look like this or be this, or etc., etc. And so then we end up labeling people. We end up homogenizing people around protected characteristics. All Black people will have the same needs. All women will have the same needs. All LGBTQ community will have the same needs. When we look at it, we know it's nonsensical, because every single human being is different, has a different pathway in life, has different experiences, and therefore will have different ideas and different thoughts to add to the conversation around the boardroom table. And that's it for me. So I think it would be really interesting if organizations stopped trying to recruit around these representation targets and actually put all of that effort to creating a culture that really drove retention of talent. Because what we very often find in lots of organizations is that they end up that they recruit in protected characteristics, marginalized communities. But what we don't hear is the disparity around the retention rates of the same people. Very often, people from minoritized communities have less retention and stickiness to the organization for a whole host of reasons, whether it's because there's a disparity in terms of internal investigations, whether it's that they get frustrated around this institutionalized thinking, or whether they feel that their voices aren't heard because the organization has recruited them in because they're different, but then expected them to talk and behave like everybody else. I just don't see the sense in all of that. And it's no wonder here we are 40 years later, in my own experience, that we're having exactly the same conversations that we were having 40 years ago. So it doesn't make sense. Whereas human-centered leadership is really about, let's recognize that every single person in this organization is a human being. And the one thing about human beings is that we're beautifully complex things. You know, we're very complex. And if you try to just make the effort of understanding the complexity of each individual in your organization, what you also will unearth is the beautiful talent and uniqueness that they bring to your organization. So organizations may well have loads more talent within their structures than they actually give credit for, only because they haven't made the effort to find out more about their people?
I think there's so many things fired off in my brain now, but one is I think the equity image that we've all seen, right? There's three people trying to watch a football match over a fence, and they all have different sized, they're all different heights, and so they will each get a stool that will raise them to the same height. Again, there's this element of like, you give people what they need to act and be represented on the same level, and that's race, gender, sexuality, some of it comes into that, but not as as the defining thing, like, oh, you're a woman, therefore you must need this. It doesn't work like that. And I think the issue there is that you build in, so there's the anti-discrimination policy obviously is very, very important, but the way that's enacted is generally in, okay, when someone applies to be at this company, here's your drop down box for this, here's your drop down box for this, here's your drop down box for this. Okay, so we're sense checking, we're doing our due diligence to understand about, what kind of people we're getting into this organization. But then that data gets managed. So like the data isn't there for then you to make, decisions on how you treat those people. That data is there just for that moment of that journey. But the mistake is like, okay, now we're going to make decisions about how we manage and lead our organization based on this pie chart and how many of X and Y and Z and whatever we have in our organization, which is like, well, that's not what that data was there for, but you're now kind of just picking this up. And it's like, we're always looking for these shortcuts to kind of go, how do we make leading groups of different people easier? Well, you can do one of two things. You can do the big four consultancy route and just hire in your own image, and everyone is like carbon copies of each other, broadly speaking. They say they want diverse people, but the people that don't think like the people that they have leave very quickly. Or you appreciate that you can have this diversity of thought come in, and you create this employee experience and this leadership framework that is adaptable. The problem is one of those is really easy to do. The former is really easy to do because it takes no effort to just design one experience with one set of leadership frameworks, stuff like that. Yeah. The human-centered stuff is harder. Because you said this, it is harder, but it's harder because I think I go back to the point where the legacy of, I've been in the world of work for 15 years. I haven't amassed the unbelievable 40 years that you've somehow managed in your short life. You must have joined the police force when you were 10. But this ability to be more it's so simple, be more human, right? But the way we disable people from being more human in the workplace, like I think Severance, the TV show, has cut it quite nicely, is because historically you've had work you and home you, and never the two should be blended together. And we are getting to that point where you're allowed to be more of yourself in the workplace and that kind of stuff. That also has a little bit of leeway the other way, that then your work leads into your personal life. That's a different debate, right? But how do you become more, enable people to become more human in the workplace? I suppose it's the big question, and probably what a lot of people at the Human-Centered Leadership Conference are going to talk about, I'm guessing.
No, it's a good question. So how do you create an environment where people can be more human? And how do you create a more human-centric culture? Well, there's so many different facets. But I think a starting point has got to be around how do you create a culture of trust in your organization? And what does that mean? What does trust mean? And what does trustworthiness mean? And I think the answer lies somewhere in between having trust and being trustworthy as an organization or as a culture. And I think fundamental to trust are several things. There are things like vulnerability, knowing that people can be vulnerable with each other. And vulnerability doesn't have to be that you come wearing your heart on your sleeve every day to work and bemoan everything in your life. It could simply be an acceptance that you don't have the monopoly on good ideas, that you don't know everything about everything, but many organizations, a culture are so innate, so strong, that particularly the more senior you get in that organization. I work with a lot of executive teams that are dysfunctional. And part of the problem always ends up being this issue around trust. They don't feel that they can show any level of vulnerability towards each other or with each other, purely and simply because they feel it leaves them exposed. Now, imagine that if you had that on an organizational level where people just simply didn't trust each other, or they didn't feel that they could share their vulnerabilities with each other for the fear of, you know what, it's going to come back and bite me on the bum at some point in time, or somebody's going to do me a disservice as a result of that information. So creating trust in your organization is about creating some level of openness and transparency and an environment where people feel they can be themselves, they can share their vulnerabilities. I think there's also something around reliability, knowing that there's an integrity in the organization, that people will show up there's the same selves every single day, that things aren't going to change day to day, and you're not left with this confusion. And I want to give you an example of what that looks like in practice. I once worked with, I was a deputy in a department, and I worked with a guy who's head of department. Every single day, people would be whispering in the corridors, I wonder what kind of mood he's in. Because he did have this this thing around suddenly turning up to work and he'd be in an awful mood. And if you said one wrong thing to him, he'd go bright red in the face and he would explode. One day I actually said to him, you know, this is not good. You know, people are saying these things and people are unsure. People don't know when to approach you and when not to approach you. People are behaving in a way that's not real for them. And he didn't like what I said. He went bright red and he exploded because I just picked him on the wrong day when I said this and gave him this feedback. So these are the kind of environments. I mean, that's on such a small scale because it's just one environment, one department, but it was a department of like 200 or 300 people. So that's 200 or 300 people whose lives we are therefore affecting as leaders. And who are they infecting as they go away and go back home feeling the way they're feeling as a consequence of work? So for me, leadership is a responsibility. It's a sense of service. We are serving the people that we're leading, and therefore we have to show up as the best that we can be. And part of that is about being on a mission of building a culture of trust.
And I think the thing you talked about earlier is that values aren't written on a wall. They're not they're not written on a wall. They're not they're the actions. They're the lived and breathed behaviors of what people do on a day-to-day basis. And I think society is pretty phenomenal outside the world of work in that it has this adaptability. Society moves and shapes the way it interacts with each other. You know, 10 years ago we weren't interacting with each other as humans on TikTok. Now we are. You know, and therefore the way our culture is shaped, defined, has a new way of doing it, and we've bolted that on quite quickly. Yet in the world of work, we see these kind of glacial moves of adapting the way we interact with each other. And I think that lives and breathes through every single facet of what we do, whether it's through technology or just, you know, the human conversation that you said, you know, you were having in that example. But you must have 1,000,001 stories about where those kind of things happen, where we just are expected to have very different types of conversations in the workplace. And I'm not saying let's all get very hippie about it and just everyone like have the conversations you have outside of work are the same as inside of work. I'm not necessarily saying that, but there's this more element of, especially on social media, right? This you build like live streamers, content creators are absolutely phenomenal at building community and conversation, which manages itself. Like no one manages these, you know, they have community managers in there, but the group is able to manage itself and regulate its conversation and what's acceptable and what isn't. But that's because there's very little hierarchy in a maybe a community outside the world of work. All of a sudden you put it inside the world of work, well, we need to have a boss and we need to have some team leaders and we need to have this hierarchical structure that essentially is the direct opposite to some of these societal structures that we see, because, you know, we're not lions in a den or whatever they're called, and a pride. We're not, you know, we've evolved beyond that. Yet the workplace seems to call back to, we need okay, I'll probably go back way more years than I should do, but like an alpha male at the top who manages everything and he's very, you know, almost like how football teams are still managed, right? Or were, you know, in the Alex Ferguson days. It's like there's a very specific type of white man that needs to be in charge of these people and will rule this group of men in a very kind of matter-of-fact way.
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm going with it, but like,
No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think, what I'm picking up from what you're saying is that we are incredible. Human beings are incredible. We are so good at adapting, at evolving. And if you just take the last 5 years, we've gone through some phenomenal changes. Everything from COVID, lockdown, a new way of working, remote working, hybrid working, the advent of AI coming into our lives, and we're all in shock what AI is, and now we're all using it on a daily basis. It's become like second nature to us. So and even people of my age can do that. So we're very, very good at evolution, actually, and we're very good at adapting. I think we're getting better at adapting quicker and becoming more agile. So the question has to remain: why is it that some of the biggest organizations in the world struggle to be as agile and as adaptive as human beings clearly have the potential to be? And I think it comes back down to something that we talked about early on. I think it's about the number of stringent policies that hold people down and slow the thinking process in an organization. I think it's something back to what you were saying only a few minutes ago, Toby, around what are the kind of conversations that we're having in organizations? Are they stilted conversations? Are they sterile clinical conversations? Or are they really human conversations? And this is not about, you being exactly the same person that you are sitting at home in your t-shirt or in your PJs and chilling out and coming into work in that environment. No, of course not. It's not about that. I mean, I spent 32 years in a uniform and in a shirt and tie and all of these kind of things. So I think standards are important, but it's also something that you mentioned, and I don't think we explored enough, was something like PDRs. Now, PDRs have been around for a long, long time. It's like the way of measuring the performance of an individual of an employee year on year. You might not speak to your boss for a whole year, but every single year you would meet and sit down with that individual against a set criteria to see whether you've performed or not. When you think about it, how useful is that? I think it might be more useful to actually bring your values to life in your organization and test everyone against the values of the organization. Are you living the values of the organization? I think it would be better to have ongoing conversations throughout the entire year to really get a sense of what Kul Mahay is all about and how he operates and how he works, how he talks, how he thinks, etc., and allow Kul Mahay to feel like, hey, do you know what? I actually feel like I'm being seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. I feel like I've got a voice in this organization. Take it away from the characteristics, the protected characteristics of marginalized groups that we very often talk about when it comes to EDI, and actually recognize that every single opportunity, every single person in this organization deserves that opportunity to contribute. That's what it's about for me. And I think when we talk about DEI, one thing that we haven't mentioned is how DEI has actually demonized large sectors of the organization. One of the most demonized groups over the last 20 years from every single course I've ever been on are the white heterosexual men of a certain age. Why? Why do we feel it's okay to say that they're all bad? Because that's the rhetoric that we've been fed, and it's so nonsense. Because I've worked with some great people fit in that mold, who actually think far wider and deeper and much more inclusively than some of the people who sit within some protected characteristics. It's this for me.
And I think
I don't know if we're opening up a kind of worms here or what.
I think we are, but we roll with it. We got 11 minutes. So let the networks with inside companies, right? So you'd have the Christianity network, the Muslim network, the Black people network.
Well, I'm going to put my hands up here. So I was a founding member of the Black Police Association, and we were one of the first networks out there across any organization. I'm talking mid-90s. So I was one of the founding members of the movement to create Black police associations in the police service. I then became chair several times over for the Black Police Association, both locally, and then I became the vice president of the National Black Police Association, which led me to have conversations with home secretaries to bring about targets for recruitment for Black and minority ethnic officers into the police service nationally. That's what I believed back then. However, wisdom over the years has taught me I was actually wrong, because I think I was creating more division than I was creating inclusion. And that's why I'm so passionate now about what I believe inclusivity and belonging really looks like.
Because yeah, it's that element of you want to make it binary. Essentially, you want to make it like it's ones and zeros. You want to be able large organizations want to be able to say, this is what it is, this is what I can define this person by these 4 or 5 drop downs, and therefore, to what you said earlier, right, I can then treat them deploy this way of treating people. And it's like, well, just think about your own friends, right? I've got one friend who's a miserable git, and he's an accountant. So that I'm not saying all accountants are miserable gits, but the way I talk and interact with him is different to, one of my friends who isn't an accountant and isn't a grumpy git. But none of that pales into what gender, race, sexuality, whatever. If I was to look at them on paper, and I think that's the LinkedIn thing that comes up once every year, is the Ozzy Osbourne and Prince Charles have the same demographic data, which kind of treat them the same. They're both in their 60s. They're both millionaires. They both are from whatever. And so, yeah, I think, and we go back to the policy driven stuff, right? Is that if you try and manage a person through labels, and I'd probably say like the numerical data, the quantitative data, right, rather than the qualitative data, that's really, it's easier. I get it. I do a survey, I do a form, a recruitment bit, and I get some information, so I know what colors like on this, even CVs, right, to that point where it's like, how do I define another human being? By a CV, by 2 sheets of paper and a form they filled out. In what world is that allowing you to have the real best assessment of an individual? Now, of course, I know interviews are there to then follow up, but again, you put the framework in those interviews, and it's like, well, as a small business owner, right, we know intuitively who we would work with and who we wouldn't work with, or who would. Why? Because we've talked to them and we've tried bits of stuff that haven't worked.
Yeah.
And so I have never yet send you a form and say, hey, Kul, like you want me to speak at your event? First of all, I need to get a sense check about whether you are the right kind of person. So spend 10 minutes, fill this form, send me your CV, and I'll evaluate whether I want to come speak to you. No, we have a 10-minute conversation, we get the vibe, and then we know we can act on it. And it's that simple.
And actually, we have that ability to do that, right? We have that innate ability, because whether we actively know this or not, we have values that ground us as individuals. All of us will have these four or 5 core values that guide every single decision that we make, every direction that we take in life. It's not until we actually sit down and do the work that we find out what those values are, but we all have those. So very often as we find our way in life or in organizations or in work, we judge people against these values because we are discriminatory beings. We are. That's what makes us human, with this ability to discriminate. But when we talk about it in the context of DEI, and we talk about biases, we talk about biases as if they're the sole ownership of a certain segment of groups or societies. No, the reality is every single human being will have biases. So let's just get that out there. And therefore, no one human being or groups of human beings are more have more isms than another one, because we all have these abilities to not like a certain group of people or being uncomfortable in that environment, etc., etc., etc. So for me, I think we're in a whole new era now. Before, the debate around EDI or DEI, whatever you want to call it, whatever the flavor of the month is around the terminology, in the 1980s, it was actually quite easy, because it was about black or white, it was about gay or straight, man or woman, etc., etc. Now the world is a much more convoluted kind of place. You only have to look back to the Tory party of a few years ago, where if you switch the sound off and you just look visually at their front bench, you'd think, wow, politics have come a long way. You've got women there, you've got gay, you've got straight, you've got black, you've got brown, you've got white. You've got a real mix of people. But when they opened their mouths, they all pretty much said the same thing. They'd all been to similar schools, ate similar food, had similar networks, hung around in the same kind of places. So I think DEI is not as clean cut as it used to be for me. And so now I think it's even more important that we really do focus in on intersectionalities. We focus in on cognitive diversity. We play some real credence and credibility on people's pathways in life, because sometimes, you can find there's a guy that I listen to on YouTube, and I forget his name, but he does a lot of financial videos. He talks a lot about finance, and he talks about what the markets are doing, etc., etc. But when you look at this guy, every single video is in his flat with a cup of tea. He's got his head shaved. He's got a really strong London accent. He was born and bred in a council house. He very often tells himself, but he ended up going to some of the best monetary sort of institutions, worked as a investment banker, etc., etc., etc. And he's at the top of his game. People are coming to him for financial advice. I mean, governments are coming to him for financial advice. And that, for me, is an example of how, if we just follow this clinical route around DEI, we could very often sort of push him to one side and ignore him, and because you discount him, because he doesn't look and feel or behave in the way that you would expect him to behave in that field.
I had a drunken conversation with both of my brother-in-laws about a year ago that talked about this very thing, that how do you build human-centered leadership and design into politics? Because essentially what you're getting is this very vanilla approach. Is like, okay, one thing applies to everyone else and every region, and there is a real lack of understanding how the economic and social factors in any geographical region impact. And so therefore that's why you go to someone like that, because like, okay, you are uncovering these kind of levers about, if we do this, that's going to have that effect, which we hadn't considered, because none of us on the front bench of the Tory party, to your story, have that lived experience. So we would never ever get to a point where we would design for your situation, because we literally have no concept of it.
Yes. And also they will have people with diverse thinking and come from different pathways. They might be the person that can actually connect you in with a segment of your audience that you couldn't connect with before. I listen to this guy because I connect with him. I resonate with him. And yet he's probably given the same advice as somebody who's wearing a blue shirt and red tie and a blue blazer or a suit and living in that kind of environment with a plum in their mouth. They're probably giving the same advice, but I'm going to connect with a guy who feels to me a lot more like me in the way that he's been brought up, where he comes from, and his philosophy on life. It's that. I think when you look at cognitive diversity, when you truly look at what diversity looks like in your organization in a human-centric sense, I think you open your organization up to so much more potential out there that will drive that bottom line. One of the things that I hear an awful lot from some conversations that I've had with senior leaders in organizations is, how does emotional intelligence really work for us? What will it do for us? And how can human-centric leadership really impact on my bottom line? And I'm saying, well, actually, it can impact on your bottom line in so many ways, but it's maybe not as measurable as some of the metrics that you follow right now.
Yeah. Well, that leads nicely into what I'll be talking about at the conference.
Right.
I think we'll just start wrapping up here. So we've got the QR code here. So if you're watching along live or on catch up, give that a scan. Find out a bit about when it's. Carl, you could tell me. We don't need to get people to scan the QR code. When's it happening? Where is it? And then we can get people to get some tickets right here.
So it's on the 28th of May in Derby at the Reach Conference Centre. It's a fantastic venue. I've held many a program there before. We have got some incredible speakers, as I've already said, including yourself, Toby. But what I've tried to do is really go across the span of all industries, from missile defense organizations over there, over to logistical organizations to the other side, and HR directors from a whole wealth of organizations. What I'm trying to demonstrate with this, and create the movement around what I believe is the right way to go, human-centered leadership. And what I'm trying to demonstrate is that there are more organizations doing it than we perhaps realize. They're just calling it different things. And for me, really, it's about how do we get emotional intelligence at the very core of everything that we do. And emotional intelligence really is about your people. How do we put your people at the center of everything that you do?
Usually I try and wrap up the episode at the end, but I think you've done it really nicely there. So, well, this has been episode 2 of season 2 of Freeformers Unplugged. If you're listening on podcast, if you're watching us live or on catch up, thank you very much for tuning in. It takes for me just to say before we log off, Kul, thank you so much. And I am looking forward to having a proper conversation with you in real life in a couple of weeks. Kul, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Catch you later.